Welcome back to Curious for Christ. Welcome if you are new. I'm so glad you're here. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Ward Sanford. And this conversation is one that I believe will both deepen your understanding of Scripture and strengthen your confidence in the historical reality of Jesus. Dr. Ward Sanford is a hydrogeologist, researcher, and biblical historian whose passion for truth led him from the world of scientific research into the history of first century Judea. His work draws deeply from the writings of the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, especially the Jewish War, to bring to life the world surrounding Jesus, the early church, and the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, one of the most pivotal moments in both Jewish and Christian history. Ward is the author of the Cry for Jerusalem series, 4 historical Christian novels grounded in eyewitness accounts, archaeological evidence, and careful historical accuracy. Through vivid storytelling, he highlights how faith, fear, hope, politics, and prophecy were all colliding in the early church. His books give voice to unforgettable men and women, just like you and I, navigating courage, persecution, survival, and belief in a world not so different from ours. And there is even mention of a possible future Netflix adaptation, which is so exciting. Definitely something to pray about. So let's step back into history and step closer to the foundation of our faith. Let's dive in. Welcome to Curious for Christ. Do you ever find yourself lying awake at night wondering about God's plan for your life? Maybe you wake up with big dreams but feel unsure where to start or what your next step should be. If you're curious about exploring your faith and finding purpose, then you've come to the right place. Hi, I'm Alexandra. I too felt lost, unsure of the direction my life was taking. I yearned to understand my purpose and have someone guide me. But I kept telling myself I was too busy, the timing wasn't right, and my lack of clarity prevented me from being consistent until I found Christ. He brought peace into my life and revealed the way to find purpose by anchoring myself in Him. In this podcast, we'll journey together, exploring the Bible to gain a deeper understanding of Him and cultivate your own personal relationship with Christ. So open up your Bible, put in those earbuds, and listen up, because God is speaking to you. He is making everything new, and you don't want to miss it. Let's get started. Good morning, Dr. Ward Sanford. I'm so happy and honored to have you on the podcast today. I'm excited about our conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me discussing these things.
Very good. Yes, and I would love to talk about your latest book, Cry for Jerusalem. But before we do, I always love to start with having my special guest introduce themselves about their faith journey and what led you to your journey with God, and then what led you to write your latest book, which is a historical novel that brings to life the events of the first church and early Christians.
Wow, I was brought up in a Methodist church, and so I remember attending Sunday school from age 5 or something. I've had a long history of being a Christian, a believer, made the decision early teen years. But I also was very wired toward scientific investigations and research. So I pursued a degree in science, majored in geology and hydrogeology, which is the study of groundwater, which is a more sort of applied science, and spent 39 plus years in the U.S. Geological Survey doing that type of research on groundwater and helping towns and states help manage their water supplies. But given that bent in me to do research, that also led me into researching biblical subjects. For example, I visited Jerusalem in the year 2000 and was very interested and moved just being there, and started looking into the surroundings of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount and the temple, and started reading things about the history, and have always been interested in the history of the church and apologetics. Yeah, I got exploring the Temple Mount and what it might have looked like, and there's different ideas, some of them more popular than others. But when I started doing that, I would read that there was a historian that many people have heard of. His name is Josephus, Flavius Josephus. He was originally a Jew. He was a Jew during the first century. And not only did he write all about the destruction of Jerusalem, but he was an intimate player in the whole thing. He was involved very much. So in his book, The War of the Jews, he wrote all kinds of details about the war. And but also in his books, he wrote about the Temple Mount and how it was configured. And so in reading what people thought it looked like, I decided that they would quote Josephus and to either support their view, and if what he said didn't support their view, they would just dismiss him as being, well, he was wrong on that point. So I decided to try to read Josephus myself. And if you've ever tried to do that, you would pick up his book and realize, wow, this is a very dense history book, very hard to read. But I found a modern English translation by Bob Beasley, his book on the Jewish Wars, which covered the period from about Herod and a little before his time up through the destruction of Jerusalem. So I was able to read that. It was easier to follow. And I was so amazed at all the details and of the battles and everything that happened and the drama and of the individuals. I was amazed that nobody had tried to follow up and write and knew about these kind of things. I'd never heard of any of this. So I thought after having read some historical novels myself and really enjoyed them as a way to learn history, I thought, well, this would be a great way to put all of the details and people in these stories into something that was much more readable. So I not only wrote one book, I've written an entire series of 4 books called Cry for Jerusalem.
That's
And
fantastic.
and that encapsulated everything in Josephus's writings about the time period. So
Wow, that's incredible, your journey. So you went to Jerusalem or you just dove into the texts
both,
themselves?
right?
I love that. And could you share with us what would be the most powerful thing just up from that you've discovered while writing those 4 books that has personally deepened your own faith
So, well,
and your
both,
trust in God?
yeah, I revisited Jerusalem in 2019 and got to spend a lot more time going around. And both times, just being there for me it just makes it seem very real. You're right there. There are buildings and walls that were there at the time. And seeing places that were described in the Bible, you can see are right there. It's very meaning and moving.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. And then sometimes we can be used to the text and they feel there's a gap, even though the word is living and active, it's accurate today. But sometimes there can be a gap depending on the translation that we read, or just because we've read it so much, we don't really connect as much. And so having someone like you who decided to write a fiction, a novel, but to reenact all these events to make it real and more personable, I can see how that can help connect in at a different level with God.
Yeah, and also as a scientist, I'm very aware of what evidence is and what really doesn't qualify as evidence, but is basically
Mm.
personal bias. And I see the critics of the New Testament trying to say that these things, nobody
Mm.
really knows what happened and they were made up or really twisted centuries later. And to me, if you actually read the New Testament stories and accounts, I had I can remember I have a colleague that used to say to me, if we told him a really crazy story or something that happened to us, he'd be laughing and he said, "You can't make this stuff up." Right? And if you read the New Testament, you realize you can't make up these kind of stories. It's just too much detail. A lot of the details actually tie into what we see on the ground in Jerusalem. And so
Mm.
one of the reasons really I wanted to write this novel series was to help push back against the idea that these things maybe never really happened. Some people will try to say that Jesus didn't even exist based on scientific evidence. The evidence we have, the historical evidence, that just doesn't hold water at all. There's just all kinds of evidence there. And to be able to read and experience what people went through, their fears, their hopes, there, it just brings it all to life. So it makes it more real for people.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Yes, science does not contradict. It actually confirms sometimes things and details that were already present in the Bible. Sometimes science uses the Bible as a reference as well because it's so accurate to where certain artifacts may be found or
And,
events.
and all of Josephus's writings just add all of the detail that we don't necessarily, wasn't necessarily recorded in the Bible. And sometimes you'll hear people talk about different aspects of Jerusalem. They'll say, we know this, or we knew this about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and how did they know that? But Josephus wrote so much history and details and geography of the whole area that it really adds a lot of historical support to the Bible.
Exactly. Very good, thank you. So I know that you're more on the scientific side. I wanted to go back to the faith aspect. A lot of our listeners wrestle with anxiety and doubt. So, how can understanding the historical reality of Jesus and the cultural world of first century Judea, where the early church fought to survive, help us grow in confidence that the Bible is true and that its promises can be trusted?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I probably wrestled with some of those early on in my walk when I started getting into science, but I know there's a number of really good apologetic books out there. I remember reading a short one by Josh McDowell called More Than a Carpenter, and some of his reasonings really helped me solidify my faith and remove some of the nagging sort of questions that would be in my mind. But also, having done all this research and trying to research things about the time period, I've written a whole number of blogs on my website, which is cryforjerusalem.com, that address a lot of geographical and historical questions that come up. And for example, two of the things that came up in all of this work were some of the things that critics will be most critical of when they start reading the New Testament. And I discovered there are some answers that have been known for quite some time that people haven't realized. So what I'm thinking of is as soon as you open the book of Matthew, and you'll come across two of these, and that's what our critics will say. I just opened the New Testament and started reading Matthew, and immediately there were two things that were basically wrong, they would say. So we see that Jesus was born when Herod was still alive, and yet it also says that the census that Joseph and Mary were under was under the governor Quirinius of Syria, the governor of Syria. So one interesting historical point was that I would ask myself, why did they care whether it was Syria? Why did they care why did he mention who was the governor of some other country? But as soon as you start learning about the first century and Roman rule, you realize that Judea was not really its own province. It was part of the province of Syria. So when he mentions that who the governor was, that was really the governor over what included Judea. And so I discovered a historian in the 19th century. His name was Thomas Lewin, and he was a very well-educated lawyer in London. But he studied in Oxford Greek and Hebrew, so he was not only fluent in New Testament Greek, but he said he studied the works of Josephus for 25 years. But he wrote a lot of Christian historical apologetic writings, right? And so one of the things he wrote and discussed was what was going on at the time of Herod, who Herod was, based on Josephus's writings. And so people may not be aware that Herod was a king, but he was an ally of Rome. So he wasn't considered under the Roman rule. The Jews didn't have to pay taxes to Rome. He could raise his own taxes. So that's what he did. But when he raised his own taxes, he put that all into all of his building funds, building the temple, building palaces and towers around Jerusalem. So that actually helped the economy. So he was an ally to Rome. He wasn't necessarily under their thumb, but in about the year 7, he attacked one of his neighbors without Rome's permission, and this really upset the emperor. He wrote him a letter saying, basically, I'm revoking your ally status. We're going to be taking over. So one of the first things they did was they instituted a census. And I'm thinking, why do people institute a census? Back then, there was only one reason. That's because they wanted to tax people.
Mhm.
So they had everybody come and register for a tax when Herod was still alive. That's when it started. So Joseph and Mary are under this registration. But Herod then died and his brothers came up. So they put a pause on actually instituting the tax and instituting the census until several years later, when actually Quirinius was the governor of Syria. That's when that census was first instituted and the taxes began. So that's what looks like there's something funny going on there, but it actually ties in with the historical account. And I'll just briefly mention the second item that people are quite aware of is that there are two different genealogies
Mhm.
in the New Testament. One is in Matthew, one is in Luke.
Mhm.
And if you start following them back, you'll quickly realize that Jesus' father Joseph is given one father in Matthew and a different father in Luke, and a completely different line back to King David. So a critic will just look at this and said they couldn't even get this right, the genealogies. But if you read the historian Eusebius, who lived in about the year 300, he wrote a lot of history of the early church. And he dedicates an entire page to this question and gives it a completely logical answer that I've never heard before. And
Mm.
that is, so Joseph is given one father in Matthew and a different father in Luke. But what happens, Eusebius writes, and he's basing this on a letter that was written even before his time that the church still had, was that the father in Matthew died before he had children. His wife married his half brother. And so this is what happens in the Jewish times. If one man dies, a brother will marry the wife to legally continue his line and his legal line. So it turns out that the father in Matthew was the legal father, and the father in Luke was the natural birth father. So this is why we have two genealogies. It was a completely believable explanation that makes sense with the Jews at the time.
Right. And so doing that research definitely helps you to go beyond your doubts and
Right.
that
It answers some of these questions in a
keeps you.
completely reasonable way.
Yes. Very good. Thank you for sharing that. So, a lot of women listen to this podcast. And so, I wanted to talk a little bit about the women that your books highlight strong female characters in a world dominated by Roman power. What can we learn from their courage and faith that can help our listeners who are on a journey of healing and recovering from their past? Can you highlight a few characters and a few stories from your books?
Yes, let me give you some background. Most of the characters in the series are taken right out of Josephus's writing. So we really have five main characters we're following throughout in detail and their lives and what's happening to them. And so the characters in the books are really not written from any particular cultural perspective. So this isn't like the Jews are the good guys and the Romans are the bad guys. It's not really either written from following Christians in what they're doing, because I wanted the books to be picked up and read by non-Christians as well to help support the whole underpinning of the history at the time. So one of the main characters is Josephus himself, because he writes so much about what happened to him. He goes by the name Joseph. And so like the main characters, like there's Nero in Rome, but the antagonist of the story is that Josephus writes about is the new governor of Judea. Gessius Florus was his name, and you can look him up on the web. He's actually a known individual who was indeed governor at the time. And so this is what Josephus tells us. He was on a journey. He had to go to Rome, and he was on a ship that got in a storm, and they went overboard with some other people. And one of them was a Roman woman who they managed to save, and then discover once they get to Rome that she was the best friend of Nero's wife. And this is a true story. This is a real person. See, but she was engaged to be married to the Judean governor. So she's in a person. She just got back from a tour around the Holy Land. She was very interested in their culture. She and Nero's wife were sympathetic to the Jews, but she's married off to this Roman governor. And so end up moving to Judea. So now she is also there in Judea, but she's become friends with not only Joseph, but with one of the Roman soldiers that was in the water with them. His name is Nicanor, who is a character that Josephus actually mentioned was a Roman soldier friend of his. And one of her permanent servants was a Syrian named a younger man named Said. But then, so those are based on real characters, but we decided we wanted to give Josephus a younger sister. Now, he never mentions that he had sisters. In historical novels and fictions, you can embellish a little bit, fill in to help the drama and things move forward. So he has a younger sister named Miriam, who's still living at home with his family. The setting is basically this upper class family in Jerusalem that Joseph, and he has an older brother, Matthew, and this younger sister, Miriam. And so you spend time in their house and what things are like. But Joseph is off to Rome. She gets attacked in a tunnel by Roman soldiers, but rescued at the same time by a blind pottery maker who was also trained in martial arts. She manages to keep this a secret from her family, but in her feelings that she wanted revenge on Roman soldiers that did this to her, he ends up training her to become one of the Sicarii. The Sicarii, a lot is quite written about them in the first century. They were basically Jewish assassins that went around trying to assassinate Roman collaborators. So Miriam is living at home, but she has a secret and a dark secret. She's going out working with the Sicarii to help try to kill Romans and Roman collaborators. It's quite a bit of the
Double
story is
life.
following her. Yeah.
Mm.
So she's one of the women characters. Yeah, like you say, a lot of women relate to our novel series because of our women characters. She's one of them. The other one then is this Roman woman, Cleo, who also has a crush on Joseph at the same time she's married because of everything that transpired out in the ocean. But she doesn't understand why her husband is so against the Jews. And in fact, he's there basically trying to raid the temple of its gold. So she ends up spying on what he's doing and ends up wanting to help the Jews instead. He ends up physically abusing her to the point where he is probably about to kill her, but her servant Said helps her get rescued. And then she ends up hiding out in Jerusalem with Joseph's family because her husband, the governor, has put out a basically an announcement that she's wanted and she's being hunted, right? So she's trying to hide out in Jerusalem the whole time. And
Mm.
her husband, if she ever catches her, would try to kill her. So she's one of the other characters that we follow throughout the series.
Very nice. Thank you. I hope you didn't spoil the books
No,
right there
I
with
didn't
all
give,
the details.
believe me, there's a lot there I did not give away. I just gave
That seems
the
quite
main plot
exciting.
lines of two of the characters.
Sure. And so beyond the intricate stories and that are very believable and
Right.
definitely backed by a lot of research, could you perhaps pinpoint some challenges that these women were facing that could help? No, yes, highlight the how these women's and the identity that they had in a particular culture. How does that reflect with today? How can women take that message that, or the experience that they went through and perhaps apply it? Or is it just to help us dive into this world in a particular time and place?
You can understand that both of these women were in different cultures, right? One was Roman, in a Roman culture where women didn't have a say to make any real decisions and were basically under the thumb of their husbands.
Mm,
And it's the same thing was there in the Jewish culture. And
mm,
yet I think these women believed in themselves. They believed they could make a difference. They believed they could make a contribution. And so in spite of the situations they were in, they managed to find a way to make a real difference in the lives of them and the people around them.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And so Cry for Jerusalem, could you give us an overview of why the title? What final message would you like to perhaps, as we close here, some final words of encouragement that your book provides that you'd like to give our listeners?
Yeah, the title, I was trying to come up with a title for the series, and I knew this was also based on the destruction of Jerusalem, which is actually a very somber holiday for the Jews. Tisha B'Av is the day that usually falls in early August that they commemorate and memorialize the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And as Josephus tells us, nearly 1 million people died, mostly of starvation, in the city, as the story lays out for us. So I didn't want to be perceived as somebody just really trying to make a buck off of something so somber. And so I wanted the title to also reflect that feeling. And so this idea of Cry for Jerusalem, and that Jesus himself cried over Jerusalem, seemed like an appropriate title. And then actually in the first books, when the rebels start to realize what's happening, they use the word cry in a different sense. Send out a cry to help protect Jerusalem. So that was a different,
A cry to God.
like a cry out for Jerusalem.
Very good. Thank you. So where could our listeners purchase your book and find your work?
So they're all on Amazon. If you just type in Cry for Jerusalem, Amazon, it'll take you right to the series. The series is available in paperback, but also in Kindle. And also I hired a British voice actor who narrates everything on Audible. So they're also all available to listen to on Audible. Yes.
Very nice. And then you have your website as
And we have
well.
a website that, like I say, it has lots of blogs and history and some of the papers, like there's some papers by Thomas Lewin that really help understand how the temple was laid out and things like that. Yeah.
Very good. So I'll put all these in the show notes so everyone can find you easily. Thank you so much for your time. Or do you have any books upcoming or anything that you can share?
Yeah, I'm also trying to write a nonfiction book based on everything I realized how the temple, Herod's Temple Mount, was laid out based on Josephus's writings. This person I talked about, Thomas Lewin, who was a scholar Josephus scholar in the 18th century, basically picked out all of the quotes Josephus had about the Temple Mount area and was really able to pinpoint pretty much where the temple was located. So I'm trying to write all of that up. The other thing we're trying to do is we're trying to make this into a TV series, which would be very exciting. I have a producer that's helping me in Hollywood. We have a couple of directors in Israel that are on board, but we just have to get funding now.
I wish
That's
you the
where we're
best
at.
with those. That
Yeah.
sounds exciting. Would it be called Cry for Jerusalem?
I don't know if they might want to change the title, but it might be called that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Yeah. It was
I
great
really
talking with
appreciate
you.
it. I wish you the best, and I will be in touch with you for upcoming projects.
Thank you.
I had such a great time with Dr. Ward today. Here are 5 key takeaways from this episode that I gathered. Number 1, history strengthens faith, not weakens it. Ward reminds us that when we look closely at the historical evidence, especially Josephus, archaeology, and first century records, the life of Jesus and the early church are not distant legends, but well-attested realities. Number 2, doubt is often answered through understanding. Many Bible contradictions dissolve when we look at the cultural, political, and linguistic context of the time. For example, the census under Herod and Quirinius makes sense once we understand how Rome transitioned authority in Judea. And the 2 genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and in Luke are not mistakes. They reflect legal lineage versus biological lineage, which was common Jewish practice. Number 3, the women in the early church were courageous, resilient, and deeply significant. In Ward's novels, characters like Miriam or Cleo reflect the quiet strength of real women in the first century. They navigated trauma, injustice, identity, and courage in cultures where their voices were often suppressed. And their stories remind us that Even in difficult circumstances, we too can choose courage. We can choose love. We can do God's will. We are not defined by what the world says about us. We are defined by God. Number 4, the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD fulfilled Jesus' prophecy. This wasn't just recorded in scripture. It's confirmed by historians outside the Bible. It's a powerful reminder that God keeps his word. Even when everything around us feels so uncertain, what he says, he truly does. And that's faith building. Number 5, faith and intellect are not opposites. The more we learn about the culture, archaeology, or eyewitness accounts of the early church, the more scripture proves reliable. You don't have to shut your mind off to believe. Your questions can actually draw you deeper into faith. So this is it for today. I hope this conversation encourages you and strengthens your faith. Truly, one of the biggest themes in today's episode to me is that faith and intellect are not enemies. They actually strengthen one another. So many of us wrestle with doubt and anxiety and fear of, what if I'm wrong? And that's exactly where the enemy wants to trap us. Christianity is not blind belief. It is faith. It is also faith rooted in evidence. So if you are someone who thinks analytically or loves research and learning, or even feels guilty to question or have doubts, well, Dr. Sanford's journey is a great example that studying history and scripture more deeply are faith building. It is about using your mind to love God like the very first command of God. Love him with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength. So here's the encouragement that I want to leave you with. You do not have to turn off your mind to follow Jesus. Hide your questions. God knows them already. And he actually invites you to lean in instead. Your question can actually be an invitation, and God can handle every one of them. So you are allowed to learn, to explore, to think deeply. And as you do, you will find that your faith is not fragile. It is built on something real, something historical, something true. The Bible is the word of truth, and something deeply personal. You are not believing into the dark. You are believing into the truth. Thank you so much for listening today. And just a reminder, new episodes now come out every 2 weeks. So we'll meet back here soon in 2 weeks. If this episode encouraged you, the best way to support the show is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps others find these conversations, and it truly means so much to me. Until next time, stay curious, stay rooted, and stay close to Christ. Bye for now. Hi, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, would you like to take 30 seconds and share it with a friend who may also struggle with knowing God and his purpose for their life? Also, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and let me know what topics you'd like to hear about in the future. Your voice matters. I'll meet you back next Friday for another episode.